Aaron, Julia, and Robert all died that day. Christian survived by clinging to the overturned boat for up to 4 hours, waiting for a rescue boat to come out. There was an inquisition, of course, and Christian was cleared of any wrongdoing. It was clearly a weather-related accident. Aaron, Julia, and Robert's bodies were never recovered. The brothers and the family were said to walk the beach for weeks waiting for the bodies to wash ashore, which they never did. And to this day, people say that they can hear cries and voices from the family members who died if you're climbing the tower. One level, let me go back real quick. One level of the tower is connected to the house by a covered catwalk or a causeway. And so on that level in the tower, people will hear voices coming from the house itself down that hallway. Now, I did my first paranormal investigation of a lighthouse here in the summer of 2005. Climbed to the top of the tower in a July night where there was a full moon. You'd think that'd be a perfect night for the ghosts to come out, right? It's actually a blue moon, so the second full moon. So it should have been twice the power for those ghosts. 2 bottles of wine later, and I still didn't see him. But I tell you what, coming down that tower was quite a challenge. I wouldn't do it to this day. No bodies were ever found, and still to this day have not anything. They did find, I think, Aaron's hat, a button off of his coat, maybe his pocket watch. It was finally in 2008 that the family members were able to get these historical markers placed on the island, because in the 70s, the islands became part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. They tried and tried and tried to get these markers placed there throughout the early part of the 2000s, but because it's part of national parks, you can't just go and place markers out there. There are federal rules and regulations, imagine that. So they even went and got legislative help. They went round and round, and they just could not get it. And finally, one of these young men, and I'm not exactly sure which one, but his name was Aaron. He was actually named after the lighthouse keeper. He found the loophole that allowed these to finally be placed in 2008. Because Aaron was a Civil War soldier, veterans memorials are allowed in the national parks. So they finally have their markers out at the cemetery on the island there. Now, George Sheridan, he was the second oldest son. He was 14 when his parents died. He was in the tower, he and his oldest brother. And the accident happened so close, they were almost home. They could see the ship go down. There was a Coast Guard station, life-saving station on the island, but the weather was so severe and it happened so quickly that no one could get there. But George went on to become a lighthouse keeper himself. He served for 14 years at the Kalamazoo River Light in Saugatuck, and many people don't even know Saugatuck ever had a lighthouse. It was decommissioned in 1914, and at that point, George was getting transferred, I believe, either to Michigan City or to St. Joseph Lighthouse, and in between those times, he checked himself into an asylum near Chicago. That situation with his parents really took a toll on him, and he struggled with depression most of his life. And I think that's part of the reason he went on to become a lighthouse keeper, was just to kind of be his give back to his parents. Well, when he checked himself in to the asylum, the lighthouse service pulled his next assignment. And so now, here he is, in an asylum, already in an unstable condition, lost his job, going to lose his wife and kids because he doesn't have a way to support them. And the last anyone, he went to visit with his cousin, who was the keeper at the Grosse Point Light in Evanston, Illinois, and he hung himself there. And I had heard over the years that the boathouse where that happened is also having spirited activity. We believe that to be George. And that lighthouse actually sits on Sheridan Drive. So there's a couple different stories about his situation. His wife, Sarah, actually stayed on in Saugatuck, and she lived and took in laundry at a little house downtown, which is now called the Lighthouse Keeper Gift Shop. So if you go in there, that was the home that she lived in. This is probably one of my favorite stories. One of those, you know, when you do research and then you get one of these aha moments where you find one piece of evidence that either proves something you were trying to prove or contradicts it, and this one was a great one. So Waugoshance Shoal Lighthouse actually is probably has the oldest haunted story attached to it. As I was doing research, this light is located near Wilderness State Park near Mackinac City, along the coast of Lake Michigan, kind of by the Headlands Dark Sky Park, if you're familiar with that property. And as I was doing research, I found a family that tended lights in this area named the Davenports. And there was a book at the library, and in that, there was an account of the wife of an assistant keeper at Waugoshance who spent a couple weeks with her husband out at the light back in, I want to say, the 1860s. And it was right after the light was built. And she notes this in the family book that something eerie was there with them, that they were not alone, that there was something else strange happening at this lighthouse. So way back in the 1800s, this is the first notification that we have of any ghostly activity at these lights. And so we think maybe that was tied to one of the men who was building the light who died during its construction. We also had a keeper named Thomas Marshall who was coming back from Mackinac City or Mackinac Island in 1886 when his boat capsized. So we have this tragedy. But one of the most noted stories that I've been telling and researching for over 20 years involves a keeper by the name of John Herman. And John came in after Marshall, came in 1887 as a second assistant keeper, and he made his way up the ranks, and in 1900 he is the head keeper at this lighthouse. And as the story goes, as the story was told to me and reprinted in countless documents and books, in October of 1900 he had gone by horse and carriage to Mackinac City to go to the tavern. Because he loved two things. He loved whiskey, and he loved a good practical joke. Well, on the return trip, he got out to the lighthouse and thought it would be funny to lock his assistant keeper in the tower. And so he gets in there, he locks the keeper in the tower, and of course we don't know exactly what happens, but we can imagine that assistant keeper, if it were me, I would be running to the top of the tower. And he's yelling out over the edge of this beautiful birdcage-style lighthouse, down below where John Herman is walking and stumbling around on the cement crib. John Herman, this isn't funny. You better unlock that door and let me out of here. When I get out of here, I'm going to get after you. 2 hours later, the assistant keeper's still in the tower. So he sends a distress call to nearby Untitled Point Lighthouse, and that assistant comes over, unlocks the door, and that assistant keeper is livid. And he wants to get his hands around John Herman's neck. But they can't find him. He's never seen again. They think in his drunken stupor, he fell over the edge and drowned and his body just washed away. Well, between 1900 and 1910, when the light was decommissioned, countless stories were passed down of strange things at the light. Steel doors that were locked would come flying open, silverware would rattle in the drawers, cupboard doors would come open on their own, coal would be shoveled into the fire, but nobody was holding the shovel. And all of these things were attributed to John Herman. And it got to be to the point where men would refuse service. No one wanted to go there. And so the local legend for the longest time was that it was decommissioned because it was so haunted no one would stay there. When in reality it was decommissioned because they built another light in the Straits of Mackinac that served a better purpose and location, and this became excess property. So over the years, these stories have just continued. Several people, even friends of mine to this day, have had encounters with the spirit of John Herman. Now what was interesting was, as I was doing the final research, I gave my dad a list of all of the lighthouse keepers that I was going to put in the book and what I knew, and I sent him on a scavenger hunt, looking for census records, death certificates, marriage licenses, newspaper articles, whatever he could find. And he came back and he said, you know that guy, the drunk guy that fell over? So yeah, John Herman. Well, turns out he died of a heart attack on Mackinac Island. Now, this is not him. This is Dr. Bogan, who signed his death certificate. John, the incident that had been passed on to me happened on October 14th of 1900. Can you read the date of his death? October 14th, 1900. Of a heart attack. But he had been under the care of Dr. Bogan since October 11th. And he died at 1:30 in the afternoon. So, listen to this theory. If that assistant keeper was locked in the tower in the evening of the 14th, it wasn't a human John Herman who locked him in there, but perhaps that spirit left one island for another and went down there and locked him in the tower to explain why they never found him, right? It's just an interesting coincidence. I went round and round and round trying to find John Herman's body. We found a newspaper article about his death. I found his interment record. He's supposedly at the St. Anne's Catholic Cemetery on Mackinac Island. We've been through it at least 3 times, and I've still yet to find his grave there. So we believe he's in an unmarked grave, perhaps in a family plot with his twin sister. He never married, died at the age of 41. So this is what the light looks like today. This light was used for bombing practice during World War II. Looks pretty rough, doesn't it? However, the fact that anything is standing tells you how strong this light was built. This is built, I think it cost $8,000 maybe to build this light back in the day. And it is on the #1 on the doomsday list for Michigan. So it's in the worst state of disrepair of any light in the state of Michigan, perhaps even in the Great Lakes. And it's getting worse. These are photos that were provided, that's Chris West, sorry about that. Chris runs the Historical Society out there trying to keep track of the light. He's had encounters with John as well. I didn't put them in. We have pictures last summer with all the high water levels. That base of that crib have actually deteriorated even more. And Chris had a surveyor out, and it's going to cost $750,000 just to stabilize the light. That means putting a bigger crib or break wall around it, because most of these bricks on that lighter level are chipping and falling away based on the high water level, the wind, the waves, the erosion, and all that. I don't know if he's going to start a fund me page on that, but as sad as it is, I would be surprised if that light is still standing 5 years from now. It's in that bad of condition. This is the Seul Choix Point Lighthouse in Gulliver. So this is in the Upper Peninsula. If you go up over the bridge, take US 2 over and then down to the to Gulliver, you'll find this lighthouse. And Seul Choix is another one that's very haunted. In fact, there are as many as 5 different spirits there. They've had countless paranormal groups go in, mediums and others, documenting different stories. And over the years, the most common stories come in and are tied to a man by the name of Joseph Willie Townsend. And Townsend came to this lighthouse in 1900, and he served here until 1910. And one of the more interesting things that I found out about him, and this is another one that I've known this story for over 20 years, before he came to Seul Choix, he was at Waugoshance. He was an assistant keeper under John Herman. There's a 50-50 chance he was the man locked in the tower that day. And I never knew until the book. I've known both men's stories, but I didn't know the paths had crossed until I dug in more for the book. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit there. So Townsend is quite a character at the light. He has all kinds of stories. He died at the lighthouse in April of 1910 of what they suspect was lung cancer. And he was embalmed in the basement, and then he lay in state in the parlor here for 3 weeks, waiting for his family from New York to come and pay their respects. Now this is April 1910. The bridge isn't there yet. So family are coming up by train from New York through Michigan, then they have to get on a car ferry to get to the UP and get on another train and another train. Who knows how many trains it took them to get there. So they had to wait. So family came and they had their service. Well, it was still April. What's it like in April in the UP? Guess where he went? Back to the basement. He had to go and wait until May when the ground thawed so they could bury the poor guy. There's a reason he haunts that place, right? And he's like, I can just see him. He's like, got this spirit. He's like, I'm trying to cross over, and they just keep sending me to the basement. When I was there a year and a half ago, they're like, you want to go to the basement? I'm like, no, do not want to go to the basement. Thank you for offering. So over the years, Marilyn Fisher, who's sitting at the bottom there, that's where the body lay in state. And I'm like, Marilyn, you might want to move to the other side of the row there. She is the director of the Historical Society, the Gulliver's Historical Society. She's written 2 books just on the ghostly activity of this light and has a 3rd one in the works. And if you go to this light, and I went with my mom in the late 90s, and we saw some other people had really weird pictures, actual film pictures. And if you go there and you see, hear, smell, feel, whatever, if you have any kind of encounter, they ask you to write it in this book. And they have volumes of these stories because so many things keep happening to people. And Marilyn takes the best of those stories and then writes them for her books. And she told me a couple more when I was up there, but told me I couldn't tell anybody because she wants to put them in her book and wouldn't let me put them in my book. So I told some stories I knew from before. But I remember in the late 90s, people saying that as they went to the upstairs bedroom that this mirror would kind of fog over and Townsend's face would appear in the mirror. Often if you walk through this lighthouse, because he died of lung cancer, he was a big cigar smoker, people will smell the whiff of cigar smoke as they go through the light. Has anybody ever been through this and had an encounter?
I was the only one there until my friend, and he was down on the beach shooting pictures, and I couldn't find anybody and I could smell a cigar.
Yep. I have 3 or 4 friends. I have not smelled it myself, but I've had 3 or 4 friends who have had the encounter. You often see, looking up into the window, some of the curtains are moved. He likes to play with the silverware in the kitchen. So when they lock up for the end of the day, they come back in the morning, and this is what it looks like when they leave, and when they come back at Townsend's place only, the fork will move to the top of the plate with the tines down. Because he was English, and I guess that's how he preferred, that's how he ate, always ate with the tines down. And he preferred his place to be set that way. So volunteers will come in the morning, and if that fork is upside down, they know that Townsend has been at the lighthouse over the night. As I mentioned, I tried to pay my respects, so I went and left him a gift. Didn't think about going back in about 2 hours to see what was still there, but maybe. I have a couple vices, and cigars is one of them. So we were up there last fall, and we went and we may or may not have stood on the gravesite, and may or may not have smoked a cigar, and may or may not have been drinking whiskey out of a flask. He still didn't come out. I keep trying to lure them with what they want. So this is the bonus light that you get in this in the program. This is the Sand Point Lighthouse. This is in Escanaba. And it was originally scheduled to be in the book, and then the Delta County Historical Society denied that there are any ghostly activities at this light. No, we are not haunted. Escanaba also denies any ties to the Purple Gang and Al Capone, yet I've seen some of the tunnels. So, who knows? Those are great stories. Why not claim them, right? Well, the day that I was at Seul Choix, there was another group of people there, and there was a family with some kids, 2 or 3 children. And you know, when you visit a light, you walk around outside and people start talking, and you ask them where they're from and how many lights they visited today, and how many stamps do you have in your lighthouse passport, you know, things like that. And as I was talking to them, I told them that I was working on this book and that Seul Choix was haunted. And one of the girls, who was probably 10 or 11, says to me, well, are you going to put Sand Point Lighthouse in your book because it's haunted? We were just there, and I heard the ghost. And I said, well, I heard it was haunted, but they're telling me it's not. She goes, oh, yes, it is. She goes, I heard her. I said, well, what did you hear? And she said, we were upstairs, and I heard a woman scream. And she yelled out the words, help me. And I got chills up and down my spine when she told me that. First of all, because kids are often more apt to pick up on spirits than adults. So I kind of believed her in that regard. But I also knew the backstory about this lighthouse. John Terry was named the first keeper of this lighthouse, but he died before it was complete. And so they appointed his wife, Mary Terry, to serve in his place. And she served for 18 years until she died in a mysterious fire at the lighthouse. And there were some records that say that there was a faulty furnace, but there are also some newspaper accounts that said someone broke into the light, she heard it, went downstairs to investigate, there was a struggle, she was murdered, and the fire was started to make it look like she died accidentally. So when a 10-year-old kid tells me that they heard a woman scream, "Help me," knowing how she died, I kind of tend to add this to the haunted list. So despite what the Delta County Historical Society says, this, I believe, is one of our haunted lights. Has anybody ever stayed at the Big Bay Point Lighthouse? All right, another big one. This is up northwest of Marquette, and it is now operating as a B&B, has been since the 1980s. The early keepers here, one of the most noted ones was a man by the name of William Pryor, known as a cantankerous man, and I never had any good things to say about any of his assistant keepers who worked for him. He finally did get a reliable assistant when his son, Edward, was appointed to work with him, but it was short-lived. Edward fell and cut his leg, and as a result, died of that injury. And after he passed away, the last record we have in the logbook from the keeper was that he buried his son, and the last anyone saw him, he was headed to the woods with a rope. And the following fall, about 15 months later, his body was found hanging in a tree by some hunters. And so, over the years, people have said that they have seen a man in an early 1900s uniform with red hair, and apparently Pryor had red hair, walking around the grounds at the lighthouse. Linda Gamble, who ran the bed and breakfast for many years, said that she would often be awakened by the sound of cupboard doors slamming open and shut in the kitchen. And she would go down there and have a conversation with Mr. Pryor to tell him to knock it off. I have to get up early and fix breakfast for these guests, and I can't keep coming down here and hollering at you, so stop it. And apparently he would for a month or two, then he'd come back. Some friends of mine from Plainville area, Ann Kirby here, I graduated from high school with her son Larry, and when I was writing the book and of course putting things on my Facebook, she sends me repeated messages on Messenger saying, "I need to talk to you about your book, I have a story." So I sat down with her at Big B Coffee in Plainville, and she said when she and her husband Dennis got married, they spent their honeymoon in the early 90s at Big Bay in their room, and she said they weren't alone. And I said, well, I don't really need to know the details about your honeymoon, but she said that when they went to bed that night, she woke up in the middle of the night with this very interesting sound. And it had this ping, 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 ping sound, like if somebody was dropping something down the wooden stairs. When she woke up in the morning, there was a single marble in the ashtray on the bedside stand that was not there the night before. Tells you how long ago it was. We could have an ashtray in the room too, right? So she's convinced that they had a visit from Pryor there on their honeymoon. Just over a little bit further southeast, the Marquette Harbor Lighthouse. I did some research, and one of the stories, this is actually one of the lights I've not actually been to yet, but I was doing some research and I found an interview online with a TV station out of the UP, and they were talking to the director of the museum. And she says, yes, we have a ghost. It is a young girl. She's about 7 years old. We call her Jessie. And she likes women and children who come visit our light, and often will come up and try to hold their hand or pull on their dress. And so I started to look through and put my dad on the task of looking through things, and I never found any keeper at the light who had a child named Jessie. We looked through all the census data. And they said that this girl was dressed from the early 1900s. And so we went through and I could not find any young girl named Jessie, and I don't know really where the name Jessie came from, if somebody just picked that up or where they decided it came from. But I actually think the ghost there is a young girl by the name of Cecilia. And this is Cecilia on the right-hand side. She's about 3 there. She's got her twin brothers with her. Her parents were Robert and Anna Maria Carlson, and they served at several lights in Lake Superior, out in the Apostle Islands. And then they were actually living and working at the lighthouse in the early 1900s when the era of this lighthouse ghost, this little girl. She was 7 when she lived at the lighthouse. So if they're telling me that there's a ghost at the light who's about 7, dressed in outfit from the 1900s, this is the only little girl living at that lighthouse at that time. And one of the things that when I was doing some of the investigation and talking to a lot of the paranormal groups in Michigan, and we have about 70 of them, with the increase in paranormal television shows and everything else, everybody's got to have a ghost hunter team out there. And they told me that when a ghost decides to come back, it does not necessarily come back at the age at which that person dies. So if somebody dies at the age of 80, it doesn't necessarily mean their ghost comes back as an 80-year-old ghost. It can come back, if it's a traumatic death, it could come back at that age. It could come back at an age when that ghost felt peace and happiness. I like to think we get a choice. If we're going to get to come back as a ghost, what do you want to pick what age you come back at? Pick the good age, not the bad age. So I knew Cecilia's life was really rough in her early years, and I also know her life was really rough in her later years. When she was just 3, her mom and her brothers, who were infants, were stranded on Michigan Island in the Apostle Islands when her dad went fishing and never came back. Well, came back eventually, but he was gone for 4 days when a piece of the ice he was fishing on broke off and drifted 8 miles away, and it took him 4 days to get back. So they didn't know that, so she and her mom and her siblings are at the Michigan Island Lighthouse in a state of panic, not knowing if Dad had died, not knowing if he's coming back, and also not knowing how they're going to survive the winter on the island without him. So she has a lot of this early tragedy in her life that, even though she probably didn't necessarily remember, may have had some lingering things as she got older in her life. But I also know that she was a teenage bride. She was married at the age of 16. She had 2 children. She divorced this man, then remarried the man. But I know that she spent her last 18 years of her life at the asylum in Newberry. And I don't know why she was sent there, but she contracted tuberculosis and died 3 months later at the end of her life there. So she's showing up as a resident there on the census. And of course, back in that time period, women could be institutionalized just by the husband telling them they should. And I don't know if that's the case. I know she married and divorced this man twice, so that tells me something's not right there. And the fact that, I don't know, maybe her mental condition led to the divorce the first time. Maybe she had some other issues and whatnot, but all I know is from 16 on, her life isn't good. And from about 4 younger isn't good. So if she's going to come back as a ghost, 7 seems like a pretty decent time for her to be there at a light that she probably really loved being at. Now, it also ties into Whitefish Point Light Station, because after Marquette, the Carlsons transferred over to this lighthouse. And this is where Cecilia lived when she got married. And when she went to the asylum, her husband left, and her children were left here with the grandparents, and the grandchildren were raised here at this light. Well, this light is also haunted. Multiple ghosts here, but one of them, according to the Motor City Ghost Hunters, is a young girl, about the age of 7. Her name is Bertha, and they have a very interesting video on YouTube that shows Bertha running across the doorway of her bedroom at her grandparents' house. Bertha is Cecilia's daughter. So the 7-year-old ghost here is Bertha, which reinforces to me the fact that her mother is the spirit at the lighthouse up the road.